Hi, we are not live at the moment. We will advise as soon as we are.
Okay. Can you
We are
please
now
just give
live.
me a moment? I think Mambaratang is trying to get a hold of me.
We are now live.
Okay, so good afternoon. We are still waiting for one of our panelists. I just spoke to her at the moment. She's been having Wi-Fi issues. She's going to be joining us in a few minutes, but I do think that in the meantime, we can begin our conversation just until she's able to log in and join the discussion. So, as I said, good afternoon to those of us joining from home and their screens. Today's conversation will be looking at Africa industrialization. This year's theme was inclusive and sustainable industrialization in the African continental free trade area era. However, we won't be necessarily looking at that specific theme, but we will be borrowing two operative words within that theme, which is inclusive and sustainable. Our conversation today is looking at how can Africa succeed in the fourth industrial revolution, and we'll be looking at four themes within that, which would be the digital divide within the fourth industrial revolution. How do we grow Africa's digital economy to drive job creation, and how to prepare the African youth for the digital economy? I will ask that our panelists, if they can please just switch on their cameras before we begin the conversation. I will be joined in this conversation by Khuputso Mahuro, who is a digital transformer, a scholar at Savitz, and a researcher. Baratang Mia, who is the founder and CEO of Girl Hype Coding Academy for women and girls in underserved communities in South Africa. Olani Sidibe, who is an entrepreneur, creative, and digital strategist, and Leslie Ngube, who is the founder of Tata, a tech company that recently launched a smartphone called Shumi. So, as I said, we're going to start the conversation whilst we wait for Mayor Baratang to join us. But I think, Khuputso, I'm going to give this one to you. I think as a scholar that is within the digital space, maybe can you please just walk us through what is for the fourth industrial revolution for someone who's still trying to figure that out? And maybe in scholarly terms, or you can explain it in layman's terms.
Okay, so I didn't see that one coming because personally, I believe that 4IR is a myth within the South African context. But I understand that it's a concept where we are or we're going to be dependent on the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, robotics to drive the economy, especially in sectors such as mining, agriculture, health. We can also do that in the education. Yeah. So because of my position, I haven't engaged much with 4IR because I believe we are still far as a country from, realizing.
That's an interesting, perspective. But I do want to ask, since you sort of work within the digital transformation ecosystem, that also just contributes to the creation of culturally embedded rural digital economies. How has the digital divide presented itself within those areas? Because I believe when we talk about the digital divide in South Africa, it's usually in the cities, and we look at basically urban areas and the townships. And I think rural areas are usually a marginal part of that conversation, and we don't really tap into that space. Could you please maybe just talk to us more about that?
Yeah, so my research is actually focused in rural communities, and there are multiple divides. It's not just about access to the internet. But if I were to speak specifically about the community where I come from, we're talking about the divide in terms of skills, the divide in terms of basic access to internet, because obviously if you are in the rural area, you don't have access to free Wi-Fi like Pani or the one that is provided by the city of Johannesburg. So there's also a divide in terms of the language. Today we are sitting here, we can talk about the 4IR, but it's not a concept that is understood by the people that are located in our villages. So I think for the rural people, and as I speak as a rural person, I definitely think it's a myth, because for us to speak of 4IR, we need to have the infrastructure, which it doesn't exist. I know, GDFI, you are engaging the youth in terms of skills development, but I think we are still far from reaching the rural people.
Yeah, and just on that, I would like to maybe then map out, what do you think are some of these causes? What creates this sort of this big gap between the rural areas and accessing and tapping into the I don't know whether it's internet infrastructure, it's digital platforms, or even digital platforms that are created and catered for those particular areas. What really causes this big gap?
I think it is to do with our history, where we come from as the people. Because if you look at the situation, the divide is not only with the digital space, it's everywhere. Rural people don't have access to education like the one that urban people are having. They don't have water. They don't have proper toilet. They don't have proper roads. So it's the whole system. So it's not specifically about the telecommunications. So until we address the system as a whole, we will keep on talking, about the divides. So it's not just digital, it's everything.
Sure. I see Mayor Baratang has been able to join us finally after she had a bit of some issues. And you join us in time, because I think this is where you are going to come in this conversation as well. As I mentioned before we went live, that I think you and Khuputso are basically within the same space in terms of addressing the digital divide that sort of resides within the digital space. And I think I want to bring you in terms of gender equality, because I know that Girl Hype basically focuses on empowering women technologically and digitally to access certain skills and address critical issues in different communities. And I think when talking about the digital divide, it's important that we put a spotlight on gender equality, particularly the imbalance between men and women in the technology sector. I do know that a study that was done by PwC states that women currently hold 19% of tech-related jobs at the top 10 global tech companies, relative to men who hold 81%. Please tell us, just in your expert view and someone who's worked with young women and women in the tech space, what are some of the causes for this divide now, particularly for women when we talk about the digital space? I think your mic is muted.
Hi, I'm unmuted. Hello. Thank you very much, Apiwe. I always tell people that people talk about the causes and the what and the what of the divide between boys and girls. And the challenge here is bigger than you and I, or because it's rooted in family structure. It's rooted in how a girl and a boy is raised. It's rooted in what kind of toys as parents we would buy a boy child and what kind of toys we would buy a girl child. It is rooted in access. Boys play sports, boys play challenging activities that will give them time to think logically, to solve problems. They are taught to fail, and if you failed, it's cool. You are celebrated as a man. So failure is not something bad. Whilst a girl child lacks role model, number one. Number two, they are raised in a society that hasn't accepted that a girl can fail. When you fail and you are a woman, you crushed your world. So if Baratang fails, I've impacted 5,000 women that are going to come behind me, because everybody will always say, look at her, she didn't make it. Whilst if a man fails, nobody cares, because there's so many successful men in leadership. So one doesn't impact, because there's very few of female in leadership. That few, should something goes wrong, it impacts a generation to come after them. Our parents, when they raise us, they will encourage a boy child to go play, to be outside, whilst young girls, especially in the rural areas, teenage pregnancy is still very rife. Being a parent to your siblings is still very rife. So that time to study and be able to engage with the world the way a boy child would, it's still not given to girl children. So what we do as Girl Hype is we create that safe space for them to come and feel that, yeah, I can lead, I can do things, I can fail, I can be successful. And not only in tech, in any sphere. If you look at what women are going through, it's so many challenges. Now, we just started 16 days of gender-based violence. I'm sorry to bring it into the topic, but it's one of those things where even in workplaces, women who are in leadership are still facing that challenge of dealing with having to prove themselves double more than male counterparts, having to work double because their mother's at home at night. During the day, they are working in the office, and they are expected to perform immediately. So women are born to do that. They can multitask, but they are not given the opportunity to do it. I hope I answered your question.
I think you did, but I do want you also to maybe just touch on a few points on some of the work that is being done by Girl Hype in terms of now tech education for young women who come from these underserved communities in the South African space. And I mean, Hopuzo just sort of walked us through some of these challenges that are happening in rural areas, but I do believe that also young women who live in urban areas and township areas, also there is that barrier. So what are some of these I guess programs that Girl Hype is running to ensure that at least women get that platform to be able to design within the technology space and be successful within the digital space?
So what we do is we work with schools, and the schools in Western Cape are totally different from the schools everywhere else in the country. They are all equipped with internet. Fortunately, the government has done some good job in South Africa. Let me not say, even in my rural community in Jankamp, I come from Klerksdorp and Jankamdorp. So not many people know where the hell is Jankamdorp. It's a very small town, but the school there has an internet access. That's where you only get the very good internet access. The teachers still don't know a lot about computing and computer science. And what I've been doing now is to employ 10 girls in the community to teach them how to code HTML, CSS, JavaScript, introduce them to basics of how to use technology. Because one of the challenges that face most of the parents, let's be real, I'm a very advanced parent, so in tech, I mean, I consider myself to be advantaged because I have internet at my home, I have computers. My child goes to a very good school. But when COVID started, most of the parents didn't know how to run Google Class. Now imagine if affluent parents in South Africa didn't know what is Google Class, didn't know how to operate Zoom, what was happening in the townships? West part with no proper connection. The community that I come from in the township, there's no proper bandwidth. They're running on the Vodacom Wi-Fi, and we all know that's not real proper internet. So it's one of those things where the community was faced with bigger challenges because schools were closed. Now we partner with schools to teach girls how to code. We form coding clubs in schools. When COVID happened, our coding clubs were closed. Kids couldn't go to schools, they couldn't have access to internet. So what we did was we started running programs on mobile phones and teach these communities how to use apps on your phone, especially educational apps, how to access education through WhatsApps. I felt it was so bad, but it had to be done. So I think teaching girls how to code for us is a step to technology. Once they know how to code and know how to think logically, and they come from that tech coding club in a school, they qualify for jobs. Most of them, we place them with different companies because we teach them curriculum that's employable. After 3 years, maybe they started in grade 10 to grade 12. After 3 years, they qualify for a job. Some of them get employed in internship programs. We've just had YES program taking 30 of our students for employment. So what we're trying to do is use technology as an entry point to better economical opportunities. And also, if you know my history, the reason I started Girl Hype 17 years ago, it was because it was the first time I touched the computer when I got to university, and I hated that. And I thought to myself, nobody should go through what I went through. And so what we're doing is giving access to these young girls that they become equal when they get to higher education. They can compete equally with someone who comes from an affluent community. So we cover all the aspects of knowledge and access to tech.
I like that, and I think I like the solution-driven behind your I guess your pursuit for change. I want to also bring you in, Kgopotso, before I go to the gentleman, just quickly, because we've just spoken about the causes within now the rural setting, and I like what Mayor Baratang sort of talks about in terms of ensuring that there's, at least in terms of competing, at least we are equipped with the ground has been leveled, basically, entering certain spaces. And I want to ask then, just from you, what do you think can be some of those solutions in terms of, the tech space and the digital space sort of penetrating the rural areas, and what are some of the important or integral, I guess, places?
Yes? Sorry, can I add something before I just have to add that, can people stop being corrupt in the rural areas? We get service providers that are very corrupt and they're not delivering. No, I'm serious. This has to stop in South Africa. Government is doing so much, and we keep on saying our history, when service providers that are supposed to be installing proper Wi-Fi in the townships, that are supposed to be giving school children proper laptops, and we need to stop having Tsotsis taking iPads from children in the township. Guys, we need to stop this. It's not good for our own children. It's not good for generations to come. Do it for your child if you can't do it for yourself.
I do think that the structural, what Baratang is mentioning, that also the structural issues are part of the bigger problem in terms of access and us being able to implement some of the fourth industrial revolution policies that have been proposed by our different departments. But Kgopotso, as I was saying, in your view, what do you think are some of those solutions, just to sort of to ensure that our rural areas are also having some of that being brought into those spaces, and how would that look like from a practical point of view? Your mic.
I just want to agree with Ma'am Baratang. It's true what she's talking about. And I think this is about the mindset of our people, as Black people, because it's us who are not delivering to our communities, because maybe we don't value ourselves. That's why we're not doing, the proper stuff. So, but in terms of solutions, I believe that there are opportunities in the digital transformation ecosystem. And I also know that government, is putting out programs targeted at young people so that they could become active participants. So what is required is for us to build capacity, in our villages, to educate our sisters and brothers about these opportunities so that they could organize themselves into cooperatives. We have cooperatives in agriculture. I believe we can also have cooperatives in the digital space. And there are opportunities. If you are organized, it's easy for you to knock on doors and ask for help. So I just want to touch on a specific project that we are working on as part of my PhD in my village. So because we don't have infrastructure and we don't have access to big companies, we have organized the community through the tribal authority. So we are busy in a process of deploying our own community network. So we believe that it's true. We cannot keep on blaming history. We cannot keep on blaming the government. So as citizens, we need to be part of the solution instead of always looking outside. So I think if we can share the knowledge that we have with other people and help each other to change the mindset, to believe that we are also capable of driving our own agenda, that will lead us somewhere. Thank you.
Definitely. I like that. I like that. Leslie, Khoputsa and Baratang have sort of walked us succinctly through some of the issues around the digital divide and some of the solutions. And I like when she talks about active citizenship. And I think that's where you fall in terms of you having gone out and created a company that's really interested in one, providing access. And I think when we do talk about the digital divide and access, it's usually around data and internet infrastructure, not necessarily access to good devices. So I would like you to maybe talk to us about why was it important for you to create, and I know part of your brand is to create accessible devices for the African continent. What triggered this particular response? Your mic is also still muted.
Sorry about that.
There you
Okay,
go.
sorry about that. So I have a limited amount of time because I have to leave the meeting. I think I informed the panel before, but I think the most important thing that made me create a smartphone or a computer device is because that all my school career, since the only phone I started to have a mobile device when I was in my first year, which is in around 2018. I mean, that's the first time I had phones for grown-ups or people who can really afford it. That was just the approach from my parents, and understandably so. Smartphones are very expensive, so I decided to create my own smartphone when I started studying computer science at TUT in Soshanguve. So I was working on the project and ended up in 2014. So we launched our company in 2018, and that became as it is today. And we relaunched and revamped. The passion just came from not having a smartphone or not being able to afford a smartphone.
And also, would you say then that part of you creating that was also responding to the fact that, as you mentioned, a lot of good devices are quite expensive, and when we are talking about infrastructure, I do believe that devices also fall under that, because for me, if I have great Wi-Fi and I have a poor device that doesn't really have access to a lot of things, then that becomes counterproductive. Would you say that that also was part of your vision?
Yes, it was definitely part of my vision, because I didn't just want to use a normal smartphones, because usually smartphones that cost around 3,000, 4,000 Rand were just not performing as much as devices that cost 20,000 Rand. So I wanted to create a device that would run the software, have the same high performance as those type of devices. And that's why we created the Shumi phone that runs the same and the most powerful version of Android. So, and our devices make use of what you call artificial intelligence with facial recognition and fingerprint scanning.
Sure. I think also, creating or having platforms like that, particularly within the technology space and the digital space, is still something that's still being sort of figured out in the country in terms of entrepreneurship, because traditionally entrepreneurship in South Africa is usually, looking at the traditional shops. So, selling your vegetables, selling your clothes, textile and all of that, but not necessarily within the digital space. And maybe because we just don't have the language or the resources to do that. And I want you to tell us maybe just from an entrepreneurship point of view, and because as I mentioned, part of this conversation is looking at how do we grow the digital economy to drive job creation. Were there insecurities in you creating a tech company in a continent that is still developing and that doesn't necessarily have a lot of access to technological resources and infrastructure?
Okay, so Firstly, I think it's not in terms of we don't have the resources, we just don't have the support. I mean, you have a lot of qualified. For example, my company, I used to train, the previous company I used to work for, used to train about 800 coders per year. So that's 800 developers that are ready to develop apps, to develop solutions like Google. We used to work with Google. We created a crime detection app, but there was no financial support to push that app now forward. And therefore, now that app is sitting in that company, and some people created property apps, but there was no financial support. Only like for private property excelling in the market, but those are white companies, and it's not that black people can't do it. It's just that they don't have the financial support and backing, the same as white people in South Africa.
I think that's an important point that you raised there. I will be expanding on that. I do know that you have to go. There is a question for you asking that how has the reception been in the South African market where your product is concerned? And I'm assuming that's speaking to the Shumi phone.
Yes. So quite people are receiving it very well, and we're very happy. And even companies that we work with, they want to work with us, because they've never met a OME that is based in South Africa, that is creating for South Africa, and people would be surprised on how much there was a demand for this in the market. And now we can meet a company like MTN's demands. If they say they want this, we can meet that. Samsung or other companies that are international, they won't meet those standards. And companies in South Africa can meet standards that are local and be regulated locally.
So before I let you go, do you have any last words for young people who are trying to get into the digital space and maybe they just don't know the hows and the where? Where do they start, and what conversations should they be having?
I think for them it would be for me when I started creating my company, I had a lot of app ideas or apps that are still in the closet right now that I didn't release, because I knew the fact that when you look at history and how America developed their digital economy, Finland and China, how they approached it, they started with hardware. They control their own technology, and therefore the apps and whatever software that gets into that is owned by them. So they can push it even further because they have the hardware. So that's where I wanted to start. I wanted to start where IBM started for America, where Huawei started for China, as Samsung started for South Korea, and Nokia started for Finland. And then, Nokia created a whole Silicon Valley for Finland, and IBM created Silicon Valley for America. And those type of companies, that's where we start. We start where they started, and we can do it even faster because the technology is there, the resources are there, the information is there. It's been done before. We can look at, China did what America did in about 30 to 40 years in just 10 years. And we can look at China and what they did and then try and see what works for us. I think that's where we need to look.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I do know that you have a meeting in a few minutes, so I just want to thank you for your time and for the views that you shared. I think you raised some important points. All the best going forward. We will be continuing with the conversation though, but I just unfortunately will have to let go of Leslie. If you do have any questions for him, where can they find you on social media?
So it's Leslie Mube on Instagram, and then it's at Tata Computers on all social media pages.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time, Leslie. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Olani, Leslie raises a very important issue about finance. So we've spoken about the digital divide. We've spoken about a few solutions that can be brought into the gender inequality problems. We've spoken about some of the solutions that can be brought into the rural areas. But all in all, finances continue to be one of those big significant issues that cripple progression, that cripple creativity, that cripple, the drive to even start some of these some of these ideas and push these ideas. Just on that, would you maybe then talk about how do we, overcome that, and also how do we present this as, I think it's realistically, it's quite a big problem, but clearly the people who are having the money to support these ideas are just not moving. How do we bring that conversation to the fore, particularly the financial element of everything?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for that question, Apia. So for me, this is all very exciting, right? Because I have experienced the digital development of this country, and I've been part of it. And I actually sit at a place where now I get to share knowledge. So all the points from everyone is just, I support and I like them, because we're all saying the right things, and we're saying the things that need to be done for this revolution to happen and for us to be a part of it. And the finances is a critical part of it, because when we speak finances, we're basically speaking economy. So if we're going to build a digital economy, if we're going to build a tech economy, we need to have money to put into that economy so that we can then reap the rewards, right? So when you are sitting with a large labor force of young people, and you are sitting with a large skill base of large people, but you are not putting in the sort of cement to sort of bind these things to build a house, then you're losing on that opportunity. So as a country, as a nation, I think if we really want to do the things that Leslie spoke about, our priorities need to change, number one. And for them to change, we need to understand our context, when the conversation started earlier on, Mehupuzo mentioned the fact that for a lot of people, the fourth industrial revolution is still a myth. It's not something that's tangible. It's not something they can even be excited about, which is fair because of context, right? But for us to level the playing field, we need to bring everyone to the same level, right? So when we go out for example, as a young person who graduated and started their own business with no funding, with no capital from parents, no loan, it was literally bootstrap. The challenges of growing a business are very, very tough, and if we're going to mention growing a business in a tech environment or in a digital economy as a young Black person, then you're adding more bricks to this sort of level that you need to climb. Then can you imagine how even worse it is for a young female who's trying to do the same thing Xolani is trying to do? So our solution is reprioritize our finances to solve these problems that will then result in our economy to grow. So let's take more money and put them in access to skills. So if we're going to help the rural areas, it's not us saying, let's forget the internet and prioritize the toilets in the rural areas. Our focus should be, let's take the money and let's build toilets and an internet room that is solar powered, so that they have now access to information to then starting to solve their own problems, the same way how Leslie, when he got to university, had access to the internet, used his own brain to then come up with the products to solve a problem. But the only missing thing was that cement, which is finances. So the same thing that Mayor Baratang said, the people who are holding the money, who are holding the budgets, who are accessing it and dispersing, the same people who are choosing the service providers, I think those are people we need to have this conversation with and hold them accountable so that we can solve our problems. That's where, yeah.
I like that part just covers a lot of things that speak to particularly the financial issue within the digital space. I want to move the conversation to skills development. And I like the fact that you and Mayor Baratang work within the space of skill developing, particularly in the digital space. I'm going to start with you, Xolani. I do know that obviously, as you know as well, because you work for Digify Africa as well, that Digify has also tried to position itself, as a company that's really interested in bridging the gap and also taking, skills to those who don't necessarily have access, and also helping those who do have access in stimulating, the little economies that they could come across possibly by using digital skills. I want you to maybe walk us through, how do we then introduce these skills developing platforms to areas that don't necessarily understand how they work practically. Because I think at the moment, as we mentioned earlier on, in urban areas, there could be a very, I guess, even if it's vague, but there is an idea of what it means to have access to Facebook and Twitter, if you're creative and all of that. But maybe taking this now to someone who doesn't necessarily understand the language, how do we penetrate that space?
I think the toughest thing, or let me not say the toughest thing, the first thing which is a challenge is language. That when you want to bring a skill across, you need to share knowledge, you need to transfer knowledge. So if, for example, I cannot explain to someone Vaba ukuthi yini is social media, then we already have a gap and we have a problem. So that's one, it's language, right? Number two, it's then access in terms of the medium to then receive the education, right? So our traditional receiving of skills education is very social and it's very face-to-face. So I teach you how to make a fire, I show you, so you come to class, we show you on the board how to write and that kind of stuff. But then when you can't see a person face-to-face, the next best medium is a screen, which is a laptop or a computer, right? So those are the fundamental things that we sort of need to look at. And for our context, we need to look at what do we have, right? So when we can't then use language as an excuse when the entire population watches generations in SABC1 and the primary language is English, but we all follow along, right? So meaning there is a sort of small level where we can communicate, and that shouldn't be a problem. The first thing should be this device, right? Almost every household has this device, and sometimes it's shared, you know. In rural communities, you find that there's one smartphone and then everyone else has sort of, you know, an entry-level phone. So if we have cell phones, let's use them. So for example, what we came up with early this year in Digify Africa was that we realized that all of these e-learning courses are available for free, but we can't access them because of laptops and the internet. So the next best thing we looked at was a phone, and the platform we looked at was WhatsApp. So how can we use social learning and how can we use WhatsApp to teach people while they're at home? So we built a chatbot called Naledi that can actually teach you digital skills. So you can learn how to open a Facebook page, start a Facebook page as a small business, how to sell online, those small skills, which now if you're sitting in a remote area and all you have is a data bundle of, let's say, 500 megabytes, you can then do that course and learn something, you know? So the solution, I think, is to look at what we have and then build from there.
Mebaratang only raises some nice practical ways that are being used in terms of penetrating the spaces that wouldn't necessarily have good infrastructure in understanding, you know, whether it's coding, whether it's using apps and creating businesses online. Maybe in the coding world or in the coding ecosystem, what are some of the ways? Because usually when we talk about the digital space and the fourth industrial revolution, I hear a lot about coding, but I don't necessarily understand what its implications are in the broader scheme of things. Could you maybe walk us through what does coding mean within the space, and how do we also ensure that people really understand what does coding entail?
Coding is a language where, like English, Afrikaans, Tswana, coding is like how we write for a computer. So a computer has its own way of reading that you and I, so there's two systems. There's a computer and there's Baratang. The way Baratang speaks, the computer doesn't speak like that. So we have to find a way to meet in between. So what we're teaching people when we say we're teaching them how to code, we're basically teaching them the middleman language, because computer scientists will design algorithms, they will design software and tags, but most of the coders that we are developing, it's because there's a huge gap. We need a lot of skills and skilled people who can communicate our language with computers. And that needs to be localized. And at the moment, when I say localized, I mean there's enough software developers who can write in Java, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, name them, who are based in Africa. I don't know who said they trained 80 people. I know that basically in South Africa, almost 800 software developers are being trained every year. Coders come out of all these coding schools. And the challenge we are facing at the moment is that it hasn't been localized. When I say localized, is that people learn how to write technology, but they don't know how to solve issues in their own communities to come up with new tech products that will impact their own communities. So to answer your question, then I would say, what coding does, when we teach someone a coding, when you learn how to code, because you've learned how to solve simple problems. So coding, we teach algorithms. Algorithms is like solving simple problems. Like, if I do this and it doesn't happen, then this must happen, then this must happen. It's like a whole lot of if statements, but to get to write those if statements and teach young children how to write them in Scratch, it's teaching them how to think logically, and it literally changes them in terms of how they will solve maths in school, how they will solve problems in their communities, and we need Africans to solve their problems. So that is, for me, that's why I would say, let us teach coding. It's not about creating a huge generation of software developers. The other issue we face as Africans is we need to understand that technology now is still coming from Europe. Our speaker that's left, what's his name? Leslie mentioned that he had to build a phone that comes from Africa. I love that, because at the moment, what we are buying, what we are using, what we are consuming, it's all from all over the world. It's the same as what we used to do, watching too much Hollywood and thinking that everything should be like Hollywood. Now we are doing the same thing with tech. What the computer I'm using now, it's a MacBook Air. Where was it made? In Silicon Valley. Now the app that we are using now, Zoom, was either made in China. When are we going to have Africans making their own tech? And when we talk this, people are like, oh yeah, but Zoom is better. No, that's not about that. It's about the economics of our own continent, our own Africa, the money that gets out of Africa to buy tech, the content, the information that's leaving Africa. It's purely leaving Africa. It's purely building the data, our whole humanity in terms of AI, everything. It's leaving the continent, and it has nothing to do with the Europeans. It has everything to do with the fact that we haven't invested enough in our own skills. We are not taking risks, and even if we do, there isn't enough funding, as Tolani mentioned. So I think there should be two. We should be teaching a lot of tech development. I don't want to focus only on coding. We should be teaching enough mathematics, and we should be doing exactly what Tolani said. Fund these opportunities.
Sure.
And just to close, when you know how to code, you won't struggle finding a job. You know why? Because you know how to use computers better than most people. Even if you apply for administrator job and you say, I know how to code, because you can bootstrap a computer, you can do lots of things like, that a normal person wouldn't normally do. You're not scared of touching and breaking a computer. It gives you a better advantage.
Sure. I do have a question from you, Mayor Marateng, from the socials. Person is asking, any thought on the digital industry right now?
Yes, I have a huge thought. I think thanks to COVID, we've realized what are the challenges and the opportunities that are facing us as Africans. And we've also realized that not all these people are going to solve our own problems. We have our own solutions. I teach young people how to code. Nah? And these are youth. Some of them are youth and they need jobs. And they get phones from a YES program. I want to talk about something practical. Our government gives them phones, and these are smartphones. Now, I have one. Where is it? Okay, I left it somewhere, but I will show you this phone. This is a brilliant, excellent smartphone. It has 3 cameras. It can do what an Apple phone can do. The Apple phone will charge 30,000. And this phone charges 2,000, and it can do what the South African phone can do. Now, what I think about the digitization now is that if Africans can change and switch our mindset to know that when Leslie's phone, it's a smartphone, it's gonna do exactly what the Apple phone is gonna do. It's gonna deliver. I'm gonna be on a phone. It's not, tech has nothing to do with status. If Africans can know that the data that goes on Zoom is so crucial, and they say it's the oil, it's not the oil, it's a money-making scheme that the Europeans now own our data through Facebook, if Africans can create their own and we buy into it. Because I think we are doing, but we're not supporting each other. So for me, it's how do we support each other? There's no lack of skills. There's too much skilled African people roaming around with no jobs. If we can start employing the same person, if I teach someone how to code and they know the basics of software development, it's up to these corporates to employ the person and empower that person through the skills development department and make sure that somebody in their company is prepared to mentor that person. You know, we have this culture. It's a scheme of making sure that Black people don't enter jobs by saying there's a mismatch of skills. Rubbish. There's a lot of educated Black people roaming around the streets. The universities are full of African people. You want to tell me the BEE scorecard is not right? It's not right because somebody, I'm sorry, this digital world is purely closed because some people are not prepared to live their privilege. And that's what I think of technology. I think technology and privilege goes together.
Sure. I'm going to come back to you, Golani. I haven't forgotten you, Mayor Khopotso. I do have a question for you coming there as well. Golani, we spoke about phones, and I think Mebaratang also just mentioned some important, or at least some important pointers where it comes to the usage of phones in Africa. And I think also as someone who's also spoken on pushing creative boundaries by just using our phones, would you say that phones are another way that young creators can use to penetrate the digital economy?
I think phones are the only weapon that we have that can save us as a continent. At this moment, I think it's the only thing. Here's why I say this. Né? At this moment, this app called WhatsApp that all of us use to engage with our families and friends, at this moment in China, sorry, not in China, in India and Brazil, they've launched WhatsApp payments. So meaning you can load your card and pay via WhatsApp. So if before your excuse was, I can't start an e-commerce business because I don't have a website, now you don't have an excuse because you can start an e-commerce business because you have WhatsApp, you know? So cell phones are probably the only thing that we can practically use for skills, for almost anything that we have. And our advantage is that it's our, how can I put it? It's native to us because as a continent, we are mobile first. So because we don't have the laptops, it's actually an advantage for us. So we get to think phone first. And that's why we're able to actually innovate and come up with things like the WhatsApp learning pods, you know? So that for me is where the solution sits, because if we're going to push for everyone to have a laptop, yes, it's practical, but for example, with my story, I could only access a computer at the internet cafe, you know, until I had to go to university. Then there was money to buy a computer or even get sponsored a computer. So cell phone is the way to go at the moment.
I think then a lot of pointers that have been raised have also sort of spoken to a little bit of digital transformation. And I like what Mebaratang was talking about, localizing, the language of coding so that it can suit some of the critical issues that we have in Africa. I want to talk maybe about where are we then in terms of behavior change, in terms of now, maybe I would say young people and some of the people that you've worked with in your rural community in terms of incorporating some of these digital tools to better their lives, in your opinion?
Okay, I think there is awareness, and I think youth know that they can play a role, in the digital economy. So what we need to do is to change the narrative also, because I think we spend a lot of time talking about what is not working. So our conversations tend to focus on the things, the problematic areas. So we need to see more of Leslie. So if we could have spaces, even if it's online, where I can go and see that already there are young people who are innovating. There is somebody in our country who has, innovated a cell phone. That gives hope and courage to the other people. So I think what we need to do is to change the story and say, yes, we come from a bad past. For a long time, we didn't have access, but the story needs to change because there are people that are already doing something.
I like that. I like that. It's 2 o'clock, and unfortunately, we have to end our conversation there. And I think I like the note that we've ended our conversation. I think Megoposo raises a very important point on changing the narrative and also making sure that inclusivity and sustainability is part of that conversation. For myself, Apiwe, I'm going to say thank you to my panelists and thank you to you at home for joining this conversation. Goodbye. Have a good afternoon.